The water of the Johor Strait, separating Singapore from the Malay Peninsula, was warm, shallow, and foul with sewage and harbor debris on the night of September 26, 1944. It was barely 12 feet deep in places, a muddy ditch more than a naval channel. On the surface, the silhouette of the Japanese heavy cruiser Takao was a mountainous blot against the lights of the occupied dockyard. At 8,500 tons, she was a behemoth, armed with 10 8-inch guns. Nestled against the wharf, she was also a cripple. American submarines had torpedoed her months earlier, and she now served as a stationary, heavily fortified anti-aircraft battery. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, she was a floating fortress, invulnerable in her own backyard. Beneath the oily water, a creature was moving toward her. It was 51 feet long, less than the Takao's beam. It displaced 30 tons, a fraction of the cruiser's anchor chain. Its official name was XE-3, one of Britain's X-craft Midget submarines. Her four-man crew called her the Mighty Midget. Her mission, Operation Struggle, was not to scare the Takao or damage her. It was to sink her where she sat, in the very heart of Japanese territory. To do so, they would have to slip past patrol boats, hydrophone listeners, and a forest of detection nets, then dive beneath the cruiser's keel in water so shallow the sub's conning tower would barely be submerged. It was a task of such microscopic precision and monumental audacity that it bordered on insanity. The X-craft was not a true submarine. It was a submersible weapon, a delivery system for two massive, saddle-backed explosive charges, each containing 2 tons of Amatol high explosive. It had no torpedoes. Its method was intimate: creep up to the target, dive underneath, release the port and starboard charges with timed fuses, and escape before they detonated. Propelled by a silent electric motor for submerged attack, it had a range of just 80 miles. For the journey to Singapore, it had been towed behind a full-sized submarine, HMS Stubborn, for over 1,000 miles, a piglet lashed to a sow. The crew of XE-3 lived in conditions that defied belief. A cramped, damp steel tube where condensation dripped constantly, the air grew thick with carbon dioxide, and the temperature soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The commander was Lieutenant Ian Fraser, a reserved but fiercely determined 25-year-old from the Royal Naval Reserve. His crew consisted of acting leading seaman James Magennies, the diver who would have to exit the sub to free the charges, engine room artificer 3rd Class Charles Reed, and Sub-Lieutenant William Smith, the navigator. Their approach began at dusk on the 26th. Released from the tow, XE-3 began her solo crawl up the Johor Strait. The first obstacle was a defensive boom gate. Fraser, peering through the attack periscope, little more than a tube with a lens, watched as a Japanese patrol boat passed through. He waited, then followed in its wake, slipping through the open gate before it closed. They were inside the enemy's inner sanctum. The next hours were a nerve-shredding exercise in stealth. The strait was crowded with small craft. Several times, Fraser had to dive to bottom the craft, settling gently onto the muddy seabed to let a patrol pass overhead, the scrape of keels against their hull sounding like the end of the world. In the claustrophobic cabin, the only sounds were the whir of the gyro compass, the hum of the motor, and the ragged breathing of 4 men sweating in the oppressive heat. As they neared the Takao's mooring, a new, more formidable barrier appeared, an anti-torpedo net, a curtain of steel mesh suspended from buoys. There was no gap. Fraser's orders were clear: if the net was intact, the mission was to be aborted. But through the periscope, he saw a slight sag in the net, likely caused by the tidal current. It was a chance, a tiny flaw in the Japanese defense. He took it. XE-3 inched forward, her bow nudging the net. The steel mesh screeched against the hull, a sound that seemed loud enough to alert every sentry in Singapore. Fraser held his course, applying gentle power. The net stretched, groaned, and then with a shuddering scrape, the little sub pushed through. They were now in the kill zone. The Takao loomed ahead. Fraser brought XE-3 to within 50 yards, then ordered, diving stations, prepare to go under. The plan was to slide beneath the cruiser's 600-foot length, but the water was so shallow that even at periscope depth, the top of the conning tower was visible. To get deep enough, Fraser had to partially flood the sub's wet and dry compartment, a risky maneuver that made the craft dangerously heavy and sluggish. They began their pass. Beneath the Takao, they met a nightmare. The charts indicated a clear seabed, Instead, the cruiser's hull was embedded in a thick, cloying layer of mud and sludge. As XC-3 crept forward, she began to settle into this ooze. The sub started to stick, suction gripping her steel sides. The electric motor strained. They were not gliding under the ship. They were burrowing through a quagmire beneath it. Fraser fought the controls, but progress slowed to a crawl. Then, with a soft, dreadful thump, they came to a complete stop, stuck fast in the mud under the center of the Japanese warship. Panic in such a situation was fatal. The atmosphere inside the sub was thick with tension and foul air. They had minutes before they would have to abandon the mission or suffocate. Fraser's calm voice cut through the dread. "Magennies, it's time." This was the contingency. Leading seaman James Magennies, a tough, wiry Irishman from Belfast, began to prepare for the most dangerous swim in the world. He stripped to his woolen underwear and slipped into a crude diving suit, no more than rubberized canvas. His breathing apparatus was a prototype oxygen rebreather, prone to failure. His task was to exit the flooded escape chamber, swim along the stuck hull with a heavy wire cutter, and manually release the starboard explosive charge, which was fouled in the mud. He would then return, and they would attempt to blast themselves free with the remaining charge. Magennies flooded the tiny chamber and opened the outer hatch. He emerged into pitch-black, warm water filled with sediment. Feeling his way along the sub's side, he found the starboard charge hopelessly bogged. He worked for agonizing minutes, his knife and cutter slipping in the mud, his oxygen hissing in his ears. Japanese crewmen were walking on the deck plates directly above his head. He could hear the muffled thumps of their boots. Finally, the charge broke free. But when he returned to the escape hatch, he found it jammed with mud and weed. He had to signal Fraser by banging on the hull. From inside, Reed and Smith cleared the obstruction with bare hands, and a half-drowned, exhausted Magennies was dragged back inside. The charge was free, but they were still stuck. Fraser made a decision. He released the portside charge as well, right under the tack-out. Then, using all the power the electric motor could muster and blowing the main ballast tanks, he wrestled the sub backwards. The mud reluctantly released its grip. XC-3 slithered out from under the cruiser's stern. They set the fuses on the 2-ton charges for 6 hours and began their escape. The journey out was a race against time and detection. Exhausted, low on oxygen, and navigating a maze of patrols, they retraced their path. They bottomed again to avoid searchlights and listening craft. The tension was now a physical weight. Had the charges stuck? Had the fuses been fouled by mud? Were they fleeing for nothing? At precisely 13:30 hours, a distant, double-thumped crump reverberated through the water, felt more than heard inside the steel hull. A few minutes later, a second, more muffled explosion followed. Fraser allowed himself a thin smile. They had done it. The crew, caked in sweat and grime, exchanged silent, shattered looks of triumph. Their return to the open sea and rendezvous with HMS Stygian was its own ordeal, but they made it. Intelligence later confirmed the results. The Takao had been dealt a mortal blow. The explosions had ripped a 60-foot hole in her bottom, tearing open fuel tanks and machinery spaces. She sank instantly to the shallow harbor floor, her main deck awash. She was never to fight again. A second X-craft, XC-1, had similarly crippled the cruiser Myoko in the same operation. The mighty Midget had proven that courage and cunning could offset sheer size. In the annals of naval warfare, it was an act of breathtaking miniature. 4 men in a tin can, armed with little more than nerve and 4 tons of explosive, had entered the most heavily defended enemy anchorage in Southeast Asia and sunk a fleet in its bed. Lieutenant Ian Fraser and leading seaman James Magennies were both awarded the Victoria Cross. The citations spoke of valor and devotion to duty. It did not mention the scrape of the net, the suffocating mud, the thump of boots overhead, or the taste of fear in a steel tube. It did not need to. The result, a sunken giant, spoke for itself.